It was a perfect Saturday morning at Lake Serenity, the kind of day that made locals grateful to live so close to nature. The sun was rising slowly, painting the sky with warm oranges and pinks, while the cool morning mist still clung to the surface of the water. The lake was known for its peaceful atmosphere, a retreat for those who wanted to escape the hustle and bustle of daily life. Fishermen, many of them regulars, had already begun to set up their gear, casting their lines into the calm waters, hoping for a good catch. But as the morning unfolded, the serenity of the lake was shattered by none other than Karen, the newest member of the community who had already established herself as someone who wasn't afraid to bend or break the rules. Karen arrived in her usual style, bold, confident, and with an air of entitlement that seemed to announce, "This place is mine." She walked down to the edge of the lake, her fishing pole in hand, and began setting up in a spot that had long been reserved by the locals for morning fishing. The regulars exchanged concerned glances, knowing this wasn't going to go smoothly. Karen, oblivious to the unspoken etiquette of the lake, immediately started casting her line into the water, effectively blocking several fishermen from their favorite spots. She ignored the soft protests from a few of the regulars, who asked politely if she would move over to one of the less crowded areas. Her response was sharp, dismissing them with a wave of her hand and insisting that she had every right to fish wherever she pleased. What started as a simple misunderstanding over space quickly began to escalate as the regulars grew more and more agitated. The tension built as Karen's refusal to cooperate with the established norms became clearer. The once friendly atmosphere of the lake turned hostile, with muttered complaints and annoyed glances exchanged between the fishermen. Some tried to ignore her, casting their lines farther from the shore, but Karen was relentless. She seemed to enjoy pushing back, getting louder and more defensive every time someone tried to confront her. It wasn't long before a small group of fishermen began to gather, all expressing their frustration with Karen's actions. What had begun as a casual fishing trip for a few individuals now had an air of confrontation. The conflict was brewing, and it seemed inevitable that it would soon attract attention from someone in authority. As the situation began to spiral out of control, Officer Jenkins, a seasoned cop with a reputation for handling difficult situations calmly, arrived at the lake. He had been called by several concerned fishermen who were tired of Karen's disruptive behavior. The officers who were stationed in the small town knew that disputes like this were rare, but when they did happen, they could escalate quickly. Officer Jenkins pulled up in his patrol car, stepping out to assess the situation. The scene before him was charged with tension. Karen was standing in the middle of the lake's shoreline, yelling at one of the fishermen, while the group of regulars had gathered around, trying to argue their case in a calm but firm manner. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move," Officer Jenkins said as he approached her, trying to keep his voice even and neutral. "You're causing a disruption, and the other fishermen are trying to enjoy their time here. You need to either move to another spot or leave." Karen's reaction was immediate, and far from cooperative. She spun around, her eyes wide with defiance. "What? This is a public lake, isn't it? I can fish wherever I want. Why don't you go bother someone else?" she snapped, her voice laced with sarcasm. "You're just siding with them because they've been here longer. I've got just as much right to be here as anyone else." The regulars exchanged frustrated looks, but they stayed silent. They had seen this before, someone coming into a tight-knit community and thinking they could bulldoze their way through. But Karen was unrelenting. "I pay my taxes just like they do," she continued, gesturing to the fishermen who had been there for years. "So why don't you go take your little rules and stick them somewhere else?" She crossed her arms over her chest, glaring at Officer Jenkins, who was visibly taken aback by her attitude. Officer Jenkins, who had dealt with difficult situations before, knew he needed to take control of this before it escalated any further. He tried reasoning with her, explaining the lake's unwritten rules and the fact that her actions were making others uncomfortable. But Karen wouldn't have it. She continued to argue that she wasn't doing anything wrong, that everyone was just jealous of her spot, and that no one could tell her what to do. The back and forth went on for what felt like an eternity. Each word she spoke felt like a challenge, a direct refusal to respect the shared space. And as Officer Jenkins stood there, trying to mediate, it was clear that the conflict was no longer just about fishing, it had become a full-blown standoff between Karen and the entire lake community. The situation reached its boiling point when Karen, in a final act of defiance, declared she would never leave and threatened to take legal action against the fishermen and the police. "This is harassment," she shouted. "I have every right to be here, and if I don't get the space I'm entitled to, I'll see you in court." The regulars looked on in disbelief, while Officer Jenkins tried to maintain control of the situation, knowing that things were rapidly spinning out of his hands. The conflict had taken a dark turn, with personal rights, legal threats, and the very nature of community coming into question. This wasn't just a dispute over a fishing spot, it was a battle of wills. With no sign of Karen backing down, Officer Jenkins had no choice but to call for backup. Within minutes, another squad car arrived, and 2 more officers stepped out, ready to support Jenkins in his efforts to de-escalate the situation. But Karen, who had grown increasingly agitated, refused to let up. She stood her ground, demanding that the entire lake be closed off to the public for her sole use, claiming that she was the only one who truly understood the lake's potential. The officers, sensing that this situation was getting out of hand, issued a final warning: "Karen, you need to leave. If you don't move on, we will be forced to issue a citation for disorderly conduct." Karen, not willing to admit defeat, continued to argue with the officers, loudly proclaiming that she would fight the charges in court. The other fishermen, who had been patiently waiting for this standoff to end, stood quietly by, watching as Karen's stubbornness reached its peak. Finally, after more than an hour of arguing, Karen was escorted off the property. The fishermen were left to fish in peace, but the damage was done. The news of the conflict spread throughout the community, and Karen's reputation was forever altered. She had come to the lake looking for a fight, and in the process, had alienated herself from a group of people who simply wanted to enjoy their hobby in peace. The lesson was clear: sometimes, standing your ground in a public space comes at a cost, especially when it means ignoring the rights and needs of those around you. As the sun began to set over Lake Serenity, the once tense atmosphere began to calm. The fishermen returned to their lines, but the memory of the conflict would linger for a long time. Karen had learned the hard way that community wasn't something you could trample on just because you felt entitled. And as for Officer Jenkins, it was just another day in the life of a cop, mediating conflicts that, in a perfect world, wouldn't have escalated beyond a simple disagreement.